WordPress provides a couple of components for creating the most common types of input fields. We've already gone over how to use the text control, select control, and form toggle components. You may already have found out that most components contain similar attributes. In this lecture, we'll be going over the other inspector control fields WordPress has to offer. We'll be skipping the ones we've already gone over. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a zip file with the code. Download the file and unzip the contents into the block/app directory. Once you have that set up, open the index.js file inside. Just to keep things from getting too repetitive, I've provided the complete code. The very first thing I'm doing here is destructuring the WP objects. From the wp.components object, we're grabbing a lot of things. Most of these will just create different input fields. Moving right along, I'm using the register block type function and passing in the usual settings. A lot of this should be familiar to you. Inside the attributes object, I'm introducing a new type here called number, which is for storing numeric values. Afterwards, I'm using the inspector controls component and loading the different components. At this point, you should be able to understand what most of these attributes do. The last thing that's going on here is I'm displaying an unordered list with all the input fields and their respective values. The block is the same in both the edit and save functions. Alright, let's test things out. You will need to import this block, so open the app/index.js file and import the inspector controls block. cd into the blocks directory and run the npm run dev command. There shouldn't be any errors so far. Once that's finished compiling, go ahead and create a new recipe post with this block. With the block selected, you should see the unordered list and the sidebar should contain all the inspector control components. There are more components than this, but I'm skipping over those since we've gone over how to use them. The first component is the text area control component. I'll load it in here so that you can see it side by side. The label and help attributes will display text in different areas for different purposes. They work similar to the other input components we've dealt with so far. The value attribute will be the value to use from the attributes object, and the onChange attribute is an event that gets triggered on input. Very straightforward stuff so far. If I were to input some gibberish, then you should see the block on the left update as well. The next component is the checkbox control component, which will generate a checkbox element. We have one new attribute here called heading. The heading will be the text above the checkbox. The label will appear to the right of the checkbox, and the help attribute will appear below the checkbox. These are optional, so use them as you see fit. Then we have the checked attribute, which needs to be a true or false Boolean value. If true, then the box will be ticked. Lastly, we have the onChange attribute, which will be triggered whenever the user ticks or unticks the checkbox. Just like before, we're updating the attribute with the new value, which will either be true or false. If I were to check the box, then you'll see true or false appear in the block. Something I want to note is that I'm using the toString function to convert a Boolean value to a string. If I didn't use this function, then you wouldn't see anything appear in the block. It's not common to do something like this. I only did it to provide another visual cue when the checkbox is ticked. Afterwards, we have the radio control component, which will render a radio input field. The label attribute will display text above the radio input fields. The selected attribute will allow you to set a value and determine what radio button is pre-selected. Then we have the options attribute, which is used to render all the options available. Keep in mind that radio input fields can only have one value per group. This attribute expects you to pass in an array of objects. Each object should contain two properties, which are the label and value. In this example, I have two options, which are foo and bar respectively. Inside my attributes object, I set the default value to foo, so the foo radio button should be checked by default. Lastly, we have the onChange attribute for handling the change, same as before. Up next, we have the range control component. This component is a little more complex than the other components. It will create this slider that will allow users to adjust a numeric value. Alternatively, they can just input their preferred value. The first two attributes are the before icon and after icon attributes. These icons will appear before and after the slider you see here. I'm using the dash icon set, but you can provide your own custom icon like before. If you were to go down that path, then I recommend placing the SVG in a separate file like we've been doing this entire course. We can also set the min and max attributes, which will let you limit the value. Lastly, we have the value and onChange attributes, which will do the same as the rest. That should about cover it. Let's try testing this out. Publish the post and view it on the front end. You should see the unordered list with their respective values. Now, before I end this lecture, I do want to note that you aren't limited to using the controllers inside the sidebar. You can place them in your block. In fact, let's try that out. Go back to the script and begin the process of copying all the input controllers into the block. Only replace them inside the edit function and overwrite the unordered list. Something worth noting is that you don't have to add the panel component since blocks don't support panels. Only move the input controllers themselves. What you should have is the input controllers surrounded by the div tag. Basically, everything is the same except for the panels. Save your changes and try refreshing the editor. You may have to add the block in again since we've made changes. As you can see, everything works just fine. You can modify the values inside the block and it should reciprocate on the sidebar. You can even update the post and the block should work on the front end. Whether you want to use the controllers on the sidebar or block is up to you. Once again, this is a user experience design decision which is beyond the scope of this course. I just wanted to show you that it is possible to use these components outside of the sidebar and directly in your block. Gutenberg is very flexible and consistent across the board. Now, obviously, the block we have isn't practical, but you may end up having a use case for this sort of behavior. That about does it for these components. You can find all of these inside the components directory of Gutenberg except for the color palette component which is inside the editor directory. I encourage you to play around with these components. Change their values, see what works. Even better, try breaking a component. It's how you'll learn.